Okay, thank you very much, especially to the organizers for inviting us, but also to all of you for being here. We are going to present something here on Heidelberg, something local, but which was the result of a larger and very fruitful international and interdisciplinary network, which we will talk about in more detail in a few minutes. Ulrike as geographer and I as sociologist were brought together via our work in the context of the IBA, the International Building Exhibition, with the topic of knowledge-based urbanism, or in German, Wissen schafft Stadt, that takes place here in Heidelberg from 2013 until 2022, and our shared interest in creative cities. And this is also where we want to start our presentation. Richard Florida was since the early 2000s and still is one of the main proponents of what we call the creative city agenda. I have some quotes here. We live in time of great promise, and the great transition from the agricultural to the industrial age was, of course, based upon natural resources and physical labor power. The transformation now in progress is potentially bigger and more powerful, is based fundamentally on human intelligence, knowledge, creativity. And a third quote, still we have not even begun to tap into our creative potential. He develops a full theory of economic growth based on this, following ideas of the knowledge economy, and we talked about that knowledge society dropped by the OECD you mentioned in the early 90s, which were developed by Daniel Bell, Nico Stehr, Peter Drucker, and many others. The main point here is that the creative sector has become the main economic sector in the knowledge economy. We can also show this correlation, at least for Europe. Here we have a graph showing the relationship between the concentration or the amount of cultural and creative industries and the GDP per capita in European regions. And a quote here as well: if we take into account no other factors, regional, creative and cultural specialization explains 60% of the variance in GDP per capita. Europe's wealthiest regions are home to disproportionate levels of creative and cultural industries concentration. This does not mean that this is a causal relationship, but at least it is a correlation. So what does Florida get from this? Well, we have to attract and mobilize the creative people, and this is especially important in his context because he says not people follow jobs anymore like they did in the industrial society or economy, but jobs follow people. If a city is able to attract the creative people, then the jobs will follow, or they will create their own jobs and so on. So what do you have to do as a city if you want to be successful? Well, you have to attract these people with the three T's. Technology, so there should be at least some firms around, yes. Then you should attract the talent or develop the talent by educating the people. And especially important people, creative people, come to your city when there is a lot of tolerance around, if they find a tolerant surrounding in these cities. And this makes cities and place as key economic organizing units of our time, because these creative people in these cities, they experience their freedom and they experience the collaboration and so on. So they build clusters of creativity. This is the idea behind it. So what is your task? As a city planner, you should build and enhance creative cities, meaning make cities attractive for the so-called creative class, offer a lot of culture and arts, image building, architecture and huge events. The Olympic Games, I think, were just sent to Paris and, what is it, San Francisco or Los Angeles? I don't know. They announced it today. You should build education facilities and so on. So Florida's and others' mantra is, if a city is successful in attracting the creative class, then it will prosper. a lot of cities and a lot of city planners followed this mantra. So the concept is very famous, and there is also a whole consulting industry nowadays surrounding this concept, helping cities to become creative. However, what becomes apparent when you look at the recommendations and the strategies in more detail is that the concept of creativity is multi-dimensional. At least you could say, see that more or less two large poles. On the one hand, we have the arts and culture, so cultural and creative industries maybe, and on the other hand, the knowledge-intensive industries and services and innovation in companies and firms. As services, you can mention, for example, the fire services, finance, insurance, real estate, but also universities, other science organizations. They clearly work together, so there's a lot of interrelation between the two poles, but in the discussions you can see more or less focused on one or the other side. Nevertheless, there are open questions. What actually is the difference between creativity, innovation and knowledge? Is something then has something been an idea? Is it creative when it is successful, for example? So we see a whole lot of social constructedness around these concepts. And going along with this, also the question, to what extent and how can we operationalize creativity, for example? We find a lot of different measures for creativity, very difficult, okay. And last but not least, the question, where is the locus of creativity? Is it really necessarily located in the urban context?
And just give you some illustration, the question was, is it really necessarily urban? And especially we were focusing, or you were mentioning, that it's really promoted, that creativity, innovativeness, knowledge is really used as a label to promote urban development. It's used by urban planners, by mayors, like a mantra to develop their cities and be successful. I'll just give you 3-4 examples. Homepages, this is the city of Melbourne, in a knowledge city, the collective power of mind and experience drives the city's prosperity, its ability to compete globally, and the quality of life its people enjoy. Another example is Davos, the science city in the Alps. So we see, of course, there's always a local, a regional taste to the way how they are going to develop education, research, and innovation, but always assuming this will lead to a success story. Brain City Berlin, engaged, excellent, international, and last but not least, Heidelberg with the International Building Exhibit that Michael already mentioned, and this 10 years building program basically has as its main message, knowledge makes cities, and they develop different sites throughout the city. This is an old American military space that is transverted now, and they call this conversion as a chance for a knowledge-based society. So the question, of course, is how successful is this really, and who will really profit from this development? Is this the whole city? Is it only parts of it? And how can we measure, again, the question of measurement, how can we measure the importance of knowledge industry, of education as a second step that is involved there, and so on. And of course, many, many researchers have tried to develop a typology or a methodology to measure investment into knowledge industries, into knowledge institutions, and into education, and how this results into urban growth. Actually, you can measure this quantitatively, of course. I think Johannes Glückler did this for Heidelberg one time, in measuring the regional effect, the regional economic effect of the university. How much money does it really produce in a way that is that sales, real estate, and everything is affected? And so he came really. You added a very large number of euros there to show that this is an important economic measure. 2 examples of studies with very different approaches, of course, always, but to provide some empirical evidence of how knowledge industries can lead to to the advancement of regions. This is a study by Gabe and 3 other Canadian and US American researchers. They analyzed the role of knowledge industry for the urban economy in actually 287 US and American and Canadian metropolitan areas. They made a cluster analysis and extracted 11 different knowledge profiles that you can see listed here. And I just gave some examples of all the many different metropolitan areas mentioned, and where you really see, and they actually calculate, they took the employment sector and the share of people working in those different industries, and then they, like the EU study, they measured the GDP outcome, unemployment rate, and other aspects, and so they created those 11 regions. And here you see important or really where knowledge comes in is thinking regions, like Portland, Victoria, Santa Fe, Santa Cruz, innovating regions. We have teaching regions, we have understanding regions, all with some more college towns or university-based towns, some with an high-tech industry following, or the spin-off in the high-tech industry, and this was used like as a first evidence of how you can measure the specialization of different regions. And their main message was actually that there's no recipe for all regions in the same way. Not everybody has to invest into high-tech technologies, not everybody has to invest into medical development or something like that, but that they have their specifications in the different, depending on the regional context, on the economic context, and so on. One other study I'd like to mention, because I think it got a little closer to the ambiguity also connected to measuring knowledge-based or knowledge-induced growth. That is the study by Van Winden and Van den Berg and others, and they did this on a smaller scale for 11 different European cities, and they really tried to account for more variables that they summarized into factors. Here the knowledge base, of course, the industry, that is similar to the other study, but also quality of life indexes, diversity, accessibility to different institutions, social equity, and scale. The scale question was included, and then they summarized their results in those different types of knowledge-based cities. They have those stars, cities that are really very successful because they create a lot of spin-offs, metropoles in transition, of course, cities that are just still transforming from an industrial heritage to a knowledge-oriented industry. Knowledge pearls. Leuven was the example here, and Heidelberg is never tired to mention that they would fit into this particular type here, knowledge pearl. So they have a long standing as a historic relation, a history of the university. Then they have also star niche players in transition, and intellectuals. Intellectuals are like university towns in the other typology because they are very high in research and everything, but they don't create a job market for that. People basically, it's a very huge university, but they leave the city after they get their degree because they don't find the economic possibilities there. So, of course, these typologies are very important, but we really think they always still assume this growth story behind behind knowledge. And since for our perspective is more related to the urban impact, we really think there's a dark side of this knowledge-focused urban growth story, and I think actually you will talk about this aspect as well in the following days. The city is changing a lot, that's for sure, because new kind of work procedures develop, networking, co-working spaces are changing a lot. People are moving into the city again, close to their jobs, in the creative industry. Housing is very much changing because there's a high demand now for housing and for rents. Lifestyles are changing and the quality of life measures are affected. And the question is who really profits from this growth and from this change, from this transition into a very active downtown or urban center and regional development, of course. So we really say that creative city policies do not decrease but actually increase social inequalities, because they of course create new possibilities and change the measurement of who's contributing to economic development. But if you look at the city itself, we really see very strong social inequalities and polarization of the urban and the urban groups due to this very knowledge-related growth.
Following on these, on this hypothesis that we had, we started a research project. The aim was to analyze what role the creative agenda and especially knowledge institutions play for urban development and especially urban inequality. The network consisted of different people put down here, and you also see David Jubon here. So we are especially sad that he won't be able to join us, because we were looking forward to meet him here again. But as you see, Groningen, Heidelberg, Montpellier, Oxford, Urbana-Champaign, these are what we tried to sample, mainly these middle-sized cities with a huge university sector and a famous university, what were called knowledge pearls by Van Winden and others. We thought that we should address this question of urban inequality and creative strategies in a comparative framework in different aspects or different dimensions of comparison. The first is the international comparison, because we said, okay, this is what we say a global phenomenon, but we want to see, we want to have a look at the local characteristics, how it is playing out in different places, and see whether it is truly a global process. Although we had in our network only northern, as you already also mentioned, the south was underrepresented. Did I have the book here? Yeah, okay. Within the book, though, we have some chapters included later by other people to represent the urban south as well. A second dimension of comparison is the interdisciplinary approach. So we wanted to include different scientific perspectives, economic, sociological, and geographical perspectives. Yeah, and a third comparison or third dimension was the interactions of different dimensions of inequalities. So how do ethnicity, gender, age, socioeconomic status, education, etc. Interact with each other, and thereby producing multiple disadvantages. Okay, I already said we looked at mid-sized cities and we did case studies on all of them. In our study on Heidelberg, so in our case study, we focused especially on the connection between education and inequality. So we also we had one focus in each of the cities that was the main focus, and we looked on education and inequality because we think there is a strong relationship between education and socioeconomic status or life chances more generally. The claim in the modern society is, well, educational success is an achieved trait if we talk with Parsons and others. So if you work a lot, then you will be successful, and then, okay, there is no problem with connecting educational success with socioeconomic status. But what a lot of people, and we also will hear probably a lot about that also in the next few days, can show is that educational achievement itself is influenced by social background and other ascribed traits. I put down here Bourdieu, Boudon, there could be a lot of other people. And And the second thing that was important for us was then that also location does matter here. For example, educational facilities and opportunities are quite different if you grow up in a rural versus an urban context, for example, or in certain quarters within a city. So coming back to, if we look at this more broad relationship between education and inequality, referring back to the creative city agenda, then we say knowledge society and creative city agenda probably intensify these already known interrelationships between education, socioeconomic status and inequality. So the gap between less and better educated will increase.
Okay, and you've seen this picture actually, you were using it at the beginning, Tim. And this is of course the image of the romantic knowledge pearl Heidelberg, but as we already said, we will look behind this picture that is promoted by the city and actually by almost everybody whom we want to invite to Heidelberg. There's never a problem that they would come to Heidelberg because it's a very attractive city and a great environment to engage into academic discussion. But who is involved in that discussion and what are the socio-spatial consequences? Here are just some maps that were produced throughout the years about the spatial distribution of social and economic factors. Here's just a map of Heidelberg with the Neckar River. Of course, we are up here on the mountain, and these are the colored spots are the university institutions. So we have the old city center with, of course, the traditional and the humanities, especially located there. We have the Neuenheimer Feld, which is the science campus, where geography is located and other disciplines as well. And then we actually have a third campus here that has been opened only 10, 15 years ago with social sciences especially, and some other locations, of course, as well. So now if you have this map in mind, we would like to see where do people live, what do they do, what are the socioeconomic factors behind that. Just a few ideas here. This is the share of student households in relation to total population, and the darker the color, the larger the percentage of student households as a share of the total population, and you see a very, very strong spatial connection to the research institutions, the university institutions. That is where most of the students live. But if you go a little south, which is not far away at all, 15 minutes, 10 minutes to drive, you come into neighborhoods that are hardly affected at all by student households, and that's especially in the south, but also if you go to the west, and the city limits end here, but there's another neighborhood, and here are other neighborhoods that already show a very low percentage of student households there, which of course has been discussed many times in other cities as well, and which doesn't say much about social inequalities yet, but it's already a sign that there is not every neighborhood, not every part of the city is so closely connected to the university. We also got some interesting numbers by the residency of university professors. A total of 351 professors. The addresses we got from the administration of the university, and we tried to map them again to the city of Heidelberg. You see some professors are living in the surrounding communities and regions, but if you look at the professors living in Heidelberg itself, again, we see a very strong cluster on the central parts, whereas towards the south and the west, we hardly find any professors anymore. And one very strong indicator of how the neighborhoods are evaluated and how prosperous and they are can be seen by the real estate market. And this is actually just a few days ago, it was shown in the local newspaper about the quality of residential locations in Heidelberg. And the bluer it gets, the darker blue, the higher is the quality of the residential neighborhood here. And towards the red one, it's the very basic neighborhoods, basically, as they call them. And again, we see this very, very strong discrepancy between the different neighborhoods. Real estate prices vary by 5 to 7 times between the neighborhoods, like the average prices. it's interesting if you really look at the market itself. Of course, it is already a very expensive market in all the neighborhoods compared to other cities, because there's a very strong influx into the city, and there's the supply side is not catching up at all. We know that from other towns in Germany as well. Freiburg is one of the leading ones in not being very expensive real estate markets. However, what we see here is in the last development in the last 5 to 10 years is that also the not so privileged neighborhoods are rising in the real estate prices quite a lot. They have risen by actually 10, 20, and sometimes even 30 to 40% within the last few years. And so one big other side of the coin is really, if you look at different studies that have been done, the number one limiting factor for life, the quality of life in Heidelberg is really the high rents and high real estate prices, because people, the creative class, the so-called creative class that is attached to the university, sometimes it can't pay the high rates here. And actually in the newspaper there was one article about the loser generation of this growth story. And the loser generation, they named the people between 25 and 40 years old. So these are those starting their academic career and their families. And usually they are those who invest, who are the buyers of housing or flats, but they actually cannot afford to pay this. And of course, then there are the other losers as well, with the lower income class. The homelessness is a growing aspect here, and the cutback of social housing, neoliberal market atmosphere is increasing those spatial and social gaps on the urban scale quite a lot. And this is also documented in unemployment rates. I'm not going too much into detail into that in this map, but I want to focus on this map for a second, because I think this is very interested in our context here, interesting, because this shows high school attendance after elementary school in Heidelberg. So in Germany, you go to school for 4 years, elementary school for 4 years, and then you school transfer from elementary into a secondary school. And here we have very different qualities of schools. We have those basically preparing to go to university at the end. That is the gymnasium, that's the G. Here then we have the middle school, we have the compulsory school, and we have other school types. And now, I think you're a little familiar with Heidelberg by now, you actually see the exactly same pattern that has been shown by the previous maps. For example, take Neuenheim again, this very affluent neighborhood. If you look at, these are a number of kids leaving elementary school, going to other school types, and you see almost 99% of those schools, this elementary school, go to the gymnasium, go to the best schools. This is true for all those neighborhoods, basically in the northern part of the city. But if you go to the west or to the south, you basically see a very different pattern. Here, the Grundschule, elementary school in Emmertsgrund, lowest income class living here, we have a very different distribution of people attending the higher school system. And this is, I think, exactly what you were referring to when you talked about the context surrounding the neighborhood. And of course, even though the discrepancies are not that high, like maybe in the US American school system, because those are basically all public schools with the same funding and infrastructure, the social family context really shows up very well here in this specific map. And it's actually interesting that those people leaving elementary school and going to the gymnasium or to the further schools, more than 50% now in Heidelberg go to a private school, even though the public schools are already very well compared, however you want to measure it, with other schools throughout the country, but still not good enough for a certain academic class. So the people going to the gymnasium really varies. Half of them even go to private high schools after this. Okay, so strong spatial discrepancies. These were just a few examples, and we really see an entrenchment of the social polarization and the discrepancies between the different neighborhoods and the people who basically are involved in this knowledge economy.
And what becomes obvious here is that what we also know from other research, that deprived neighborhoods are becoming disadvantaging neighborhoods. Yeah, that the pupils from these neighborhoods, like Boxberg and Emmertsgrund, they don't have the same chances to go on to university as those coming from Neuenheim. Besides socioeconomic variables, we also were able to include some questions about attitudes towards the university and science organizations in the yearly survey of Heidelberg citizens. What is obvious here is a huge support of citizens. More than 90% associate something good or very good with the university and other science organizations. However, education is one of the most important factors here. If we look here, while support is still high, it is considerably lower for those with only compulsory education, Hauptschule in Germany, than for the average, or especially for those with a higher education degree. The same is true for a question about how much Heidelberg is benefiting from the university. Again, huge support overall, but considerably lower for compulsory schooling, people with only compulsory schooling. So, if we look at the, not only at education background, but at the different quarters of the town, we see even clearer distinction. I now divided the categories even more into very much less and not at all. They were put together in these here. I should have shown the first one as well in that. What we see again, all respondents, sorry, you can't see the figures here. All respondents with a huge support, very much or much. In Neuenheim, next to the science campus, in the old town, in the Altstadt, next to the Arts and Humanities campus, or in the Bahnstadt, the newly celebrated area for the creative class, combining, what do they always say, living, working and sleeping also. So everywhere we see a huge support, but it's considerably lower in Bergheim, where we have the new campus now for 10 years, and the Boxberg-Emmertsgrund, which were the most deprived quarters, where less than half of the people say that Heidelberg benefits from the university. Probably for them they are right, yes, because they are not profiting as much as the other areas from this. And Bergheim, there we have the feeling that, or some indicators hint to the thing that we have a division within Bergheim where this new campus is. A lot of people benefit from the new campus, and but prices for the living goes up. It becomes more crowded, the area, and so on. And so old residents are probably not too happy about that. So what have we learned from our research project so far? First, we see that there is a clear, strong segmentation of the urban landscape, also in a city that is quite affluent like Heidelberg. Education seems to be important as a trigger for growth and inequality, and knowledge is inherited through households and the creative economy and tied to specific places within the city. So we think that these are indicators that the creative city agenda is intensifying the influence of education on individual life chances. We didn't look at these differences between cities, but there is also a lot of research on that, because not every city can benefit from it, but there are losers and winners, and the whole creative and cultural industries are to a large extent winner takes it all games. You know? There are some people that win a lot of money from this and they are very successful, and some others that do nearly as good or maybe even as good but don't get anything out of it. And then an intensifying segmentation within cities and thereby also an increase in urban inequality. One important point here is that creative city policies aim at those that are already better off instead of supporting the most disadvantaged. While we had social programs such as social housing or die soziale Stadt in Germany for quite a while, the new neoliberal discourses and policies support the middle and upper classes. So, for example, the Bahnstadt, instead of Boxberg, gets a lot of money for new childcare facilities, new schools, etc., to attract young, creative, well-educated people, instead of supporting the less well-off.
I'm very happy to say last few words about the other case studies in our research. And actually, David is not here, unfortunately, so even more happy I am to just mention his contribution to the network, where he actually exactly observed very similar polarizing trends in Montpellier. And his main hypothesis, his main thesis was that the tram, the introduction of a very welcomed, highly celebrated introduction of a new mobility facility, is basically a very strong gentrifier of the of certain neighborhoods, especially those connected to the knowledge economy, to the university, whereas other neighborhoods, and he actually wanted to talk about exactly this one neighborhood in downtown Montpellier that is very strongly affected by a decrease of investment, of attention, also because the tram line is not connecting this. So there are different factors entrenching this inequality, these discrepancies between the neighborhoods. Linda McDowell from Oxford, for example, she introduced the perspective of the female migrant workers that are basically a large proportion of the service industry, but very low income jobs, very unsecure contracts. So also they are basically more or less suffering from this growth story. So to come back to Richard Florida, since we started with him, he actually had understood the ambiguity of creative city growth as well by now. He just, I don't know whom of you have read this book already or seen this book. Peter, you mentioned this as well in a few days ago, that Richard Florida just wrote a book where he admitted, I had been overly optimistic to believe that cities and the creative class could by themselves bring forth a better and more inclusive kind of urbanism. The artistic and creative ferment was giving way to a new kind of homogeneity of wealthy people, so in contrast to his heterogeneity factor, high-end restaurants and luxury jobs. And then he, on a different page, he says, I had no idea how fast these new divides would metastasize and how deeply polarized these cities would become. So our question is, of course, we all know about those problems, about those consequences of growth, but what can we do about it? How can we change it, especially in this neoliberal market agenda? Will his book sell as well with this called The New Urban Crisis that he is announcing there? Yeah, he will, of course he will, but still, how will urban politicians really use this message and you use this understanding of the dark side of the growth story, and also will they implement it maybe into different leitmotifs of urban development, like you remember our homepages at the beginning about the growth and creative and so on. Maybe the inclusive city will be a catchword for future development. Sustainability, of course, is a big trophy and a big I don't know, debate, discourse now, also hiding, of course, the inequalities behind their policies. However, our question really is, how can we cope with this? How can the educational system accommodate these discrepancies, and what will be the future of urban development, also in the knowledge society? Thank you.